What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 34, and I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I'm joined by Dave DeCamp of antiwar.com on today's show. But before we get into the interview, real quick, just going to take a minute to thank the sponsor of the show, and that is Paloma Verde. Over at Paloma Verde, they make great CBD products. Go to palomaverdestore.com. You get information on CBD. They have research and lab tests to show that their products are what they say they are, and then they have education on how CBD could help you. Personally, like CBD helps to take a little bit of the edge off. It also helps with a little bit of just back pain I deal with every day. So if you have different things going on, inflammation, anxiety, stuff like that, think about checking out CBD products. If you shop at Paloma Verde, you're shopping with a great libertarian family. Carlos and his wife Vanessa are excellent people. They are always posting, where they are, what they're doing on Facebook. So check it out, palomaverdestore.com. Use the promo code PEACE for 25% off at checkout. And now let's get into the interview. Dave, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Good, Kyle. Thanks for having me on. My first time on the new show.
Yeah, I think you were on Foreign Policy Focus at least once, and I'll throw one of those, if not more than one of the links in the show notes page. But yeah, good to have you on video today, and we have a lot to talk about for people who aren't too familiar with Dave's work. He is the assistant news editor at antiwar.com, and pretty much every day now, if you go to the page and look at the top in the news section, there's 2, 3, 4 sometimes write-ups there by Dave DeCamp. And so for those of us in the anti-war movement, it's you and Jason did to keep us informed on what's happening in the world. So I'm really excited to have you on today's show. I have a variety of things to talk about, stuff you've written up in the past week. I want to start actually with a couple articles that are, I guess, more on the Trump policy focus rather than we'll get into like what may be happening with Biden in the future. But two articles here are U.S. military using private planes to spy on China in the Pacific, and Pompeo saying the Trump administration isn't finished with China yet. So that sounds pretty threatening. But let's start with the U.S. using the private planes to spy on China. How's that work?
Yeah, well, this is from it's a Beijing-based think tank. They publish these reports that are pretty good, and they monitor flights in the region. And this report, they said they used three different examples of planes since March to I believe August is when they tracked it. And yeah, they were flying around the South China Sea, Philippine Sea, the East China Sea, those areas, and they recorded them landing and taking off from U.S. military bases in the Philippines, in Okinawa, and Japan. So yeah, it's just another way that the U.S. is keeping an eye on what China's doing over there in the South China Sea. And I follow this area a lot because I think it's pretty important. This same think tank, the South China Sea Probing Initiative is the name of them. They recorded a pretty major uptick in U.S. military flights in the region, and this is different than the private planes. These are actual military aircraft. It was something like in May of this year, they recorded 30 something. June, it was about 40. And in July, it was about 67. And it's kind of stayed at that number. And the planes, they're mostly flying around the South China Sea, sometimes the Taiwan Strait. Sometimes there was about 3 instances where they flew directly over the island of Taiwan. And that's it's something that the U.S. military generally avoids. So it's pretty provocative to fly right over Taiwan. They know what they're doing. They're sending a message to China that they're over there. And yeah, it's a dangerous thing because it risks an accident. Same thing with sending all the warships and aircraft carriers in that part of the world near these islands. The Paracel Islands is one of them. It's a disputed archipelago. In 2001, this was right before 9/11, during the Bush administration, there was a accident near Hainan Island, which is the southernmost territory of China. It's a big island. It's their territory. There's no question about it. there's no dispute over Hainan. It's big. It's a pretty big landmass. A U.S. spy plane collided with a Chinese military plane, maybe a jet or something, and the Chinese pilot died. The U.S. pilot was able to land, and it caused kind of a big diplomatic incident for George W. Bush, and they squashed it pretty easily. But if you think about the U.S. and China were getting along pretty well in the first part of this millennia, and now things are really bad. And so if something like that happens again, it can really escalate in a way. And a lot of the hawks might think it could just be a naval battle, and that's part of the reason why Esper, well, he was just fired, but the Pentagon, the national defense strategy, it's all about China and Russia away from counterterrorism. Great power competition is it's what the military is focused on now. There's a lot of money to be made surrounding China. They have technically a bigger Navy fleet than the U.S. They have more ships, but if you look at things like tonnage, the U.S. Navy, it's like more than double the amount of tonnage. What means is the size of the ship. Like we have 11 aircraft carriers, they have 2. So when it comes to real power, I think the U.S. Wins in that department. But the U.S. Navy is stretched across the entire world. China just has to worry about their own waters. So they are building up a formidable Navy, and it's a reaction to all this, to U.S. warships. So it's kind of like this cycle. We send a destroyer near a Chinese claimed island, and they make a missile that they can hit the destroyer with. And, it's just dangerous stuff. So it's something to keep an eye on. And it's on my track. I try to always make sure I'm on top of what's going on over there.
Yeah, well, I mean, with as many flights as the U.S. has been carrying out, I think me and Will had talked about one of your articles, 60 spy, flights alone in September, and I think you might have also written up the one where the U.S. was flying over like Chinese military drills and stuff like that. But we see that this happened with Russia too, where then the Russian will send their fighter aircraft to come intercept and harass our planes, and so it seems just kind of like a matter of chance that we're going to have a replay of what happened in 2001, where eventually some Chinese or Russian plane will collide with an American plane. As you point out, things between the U.S. and China, also the U.S. and Russia. I mean, remember back in 2001, it was Vladimir, but I remember this like being a major headline. Right after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, even Russia, our old arch enemies, like called right away and were like, "Hey, what can we do to help out?" And actually apparently gave some like pretty critical like logistical and military based support as far as like carrying out operations in Afghanistan, the early days of that war and stuff like that. But that's certainly not the case today. And so one of these incidents could, I feel like, really spiral and escalate. The other thing you're talking about is like the size of the U.S. and Chinese Navy and how, look, I mean, I think if anybody, puts the two navies out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, or fights like the string of battles that the U.S. fought against Japan in World War II, I'm sure the U.S. would absolutely dominate it. But what we're talking about here is the U.S. fighting a war with China right off China's coast for Taiwan. I guess they're not even delusional enough to really think they would fight a war over Hong Kong, but they certainly would over the South China Sea, or at least like wargame and plan for it. And just seems so crazy to think that what the U.S. needs to be able to do is against the largest economy in the world dominate their own coastline. But that's essentially what the U.S. wants here, and it seems to be the case. No matter what's going on with Steve Bannon, I'm not sure if he's in jail or not right now, but he was really pushing for this in the Trump administration. Before we move on to talking about Biden's China policy, I did just want to look at this other story. Pompeo saying the Trump administration is not finished with China. So what's this about? And man, does this guy, yeah, I know Danny Surgeon writes up for us a lot, this guy feeling like he's in the mafia or something like that. But he really does play up the role, doesn't he, of like wanting to be in mafia, Don?
Yeah, I mean, he's been on like this tour, over the past few months of like an anti-China world tour. He was just finished a visit to South Asia. He visited India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and he was just the things he would say just completely unhinged about China. But yeah, he said this. I believe it was last week that the Trump administration is not finished yet with China, and since then there's been some additional sanctions. Um, the U.S. sanctioned some Chinese and Hong Kong officials over the national security law in Hong Kong. Uh, Trump banned earlier in the year. The U.S. determined that I think it was 31 Chinese companies were backed by the Chinese military, so kind of setting up for sanctions. One of them was Huawei, the 5G company that the U.S. is on a crusade against. And so the other day, Trump banned investments, U.S. investors, from putting their money into these companies. And it's not clear exactly how they determined that they were backed by the military, because there's always some state involvement in China with these companies. But I mean, if you look at corporations in the U.S. Really, the thing is that senators have written letters about this. Like, this is all bipartisan stuff here. The way Trump has ramped it up and the rhetoric is kind of a little more unhinged, but there's a general consensus in Washington that we need to have these kind of technology wars, trade wars, whatever you want to call them, with China. And yeah, but with Huawei, but what was I saying? How they determine that they're backed by the military. I mean, the standard is that they say that they're using civilian technology, and then it gets transferred to their military. But I mean, if that's the standard, then what is, all these U.S. corporations that work with our military and all the technology transfer that goes on there? It's a bit hypocritical. And with Huawei too, it's pretty interesting. Some of the Snowden documents. There's a document that from the NSA. It was in 2007. They hacked Huawei, and in the document, it said that a lot of our targets are starting to use these Huawei phones. We have to make sure we can access them. So part of the reason why the U.S. doesn't want companies using Huawei could be related to our worldwide surveillance through the NSA and stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's a lot of it. It's we are the world empire, and the world empire doesn't like to lose power. And so if companies start to drift towards Chinese based technologies, I guess it would give China the bigger or better ability to do some spying there. But you mentioned that a lot of this policy is bipartisan. I want to get into that, and that's where you have people dancing in the streets and celebrating, like the evil has gone from the world and has been vanquished, and we're about to see an entirely new and different world. But that's despite the fact that Biden himself has made statements like nothing fundamentally will change. But this one really seems to indicate that the U.S. policy towards um, China isn't going anywhere. And I think you had a write up on this from some experts from the South China Morning Post that I had talked about in a previous episode of the show. But this particular write up here, Biden says U.S. Japan defense treaty covers Senkaku Islands. So tell people where the Senkaku Islands are, because now everybody's watching on video and gets to see the map, so it's real easy to figure out, and then why they're important.
Yeah, so the Senkaku Islands, Japan controls them. If people can look at the map, you can see they're actually closer to Taiwan than either China or Japan. So Taiwan claims them, China claims them, and Japan claims them. And they were actually administered by the U.S. after World War II, and they were transferred back to Japan in 1971. And Japan claims them. They first claimed them. Imperial Japan did in 1895. China, they go back. They say they controlled it before then, and then Taiwan has their stake in it. But there's been some Chinese like Coast Guard vessels have sailed near the islands recently, and yeah, so it's a maritime dispute between Japan and China, and the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with Japan. If Japan gets attacked, the U.S. um, will intervene to protect them. And there is some controversy over whether or not it covers these islands. And Biden's first phone call to the leader of Japan, uh, in that phone call, according to the Japanese Prime Minister, Biden affirmed that the Mutual Defense Treaty does cover the Senkaku Islands. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just another flashpoint, another island dispute. And there was war games recently, a few weeks ago, with the U.S. joint U.S.-Japan war games. And when it was kicked off, the U.S. commander for forces in Japan, he oversees all of the U.S. military in Japan, Okinawa, and they did like a little mock landing on some islands off Japan, not the Senkakus. But he said, this is to demonstrate that we can deploy troops to the Senkaku Islands to defend them. A clear reference to China. Who else would they be defending them from? So yeah, I mean, it's just it's a tense situation over there, and Biden. I'm sure Trump would be willing to defend the islands from China, but it's interesting. One of Biden's first foreign policy statements was that the treaty covers these islands. And the thing you mentioned from the South China Morning Post, their analysts pointed out that all this South China Sea stuff started under Obama. When China started claiming these islands, the U.S. response was to sail warships. They kind of squandered the opportunity to really try diplomacy, and started what they called freedom of navigation operations and sailing warships pretty close to these Chinese claimed islands. And Biden bragged about it at the last presidential debate when they were talking about China. He said, he was trying to set up, trying to tell us we can't fly planes by these islands. And we threw B-1 bombers over them, I think is what he said. So yeah, in this area, Biden, and I mean, if you want to talk about Michelle Flournoy.
Yeah, let's move on and talk more broadly about Biden's teams. Here,
Yeah.
I have this one, two articles by you. I think they're pretty related. Biden's Pentagon transition team members funded by the arms industry. And then the other one, House Democrats warn Biden against hiring SecDef with armed industry ties. And so, you brought up the name there, Michelle Flournoy. And let's go. We talk about her first, and then let's hit on some other people who look like they're headed towards the Obama administration or Biden administration. God, I keep saying that. And having some deep ties to some people who love war.
Yeah. So Michelle Flournoy, she's just about as bad as you can get, it looks like. She was in the Clinton administration, in the Obama administration, but she founded the Center for a New American Security in 2007, which is kind of like the premier neocon think tank in Washington now. And she actually, in one example that I used to say how horrible she is, in 2005, PNAC, Project for a New American Century, kind of like, they're pretty notorious now. That was Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, John Bolton, all them. They, sent a letter to George W. Bush in 2005 to increase troop numbers in Iraq. So this is, after 2005, most people realized it was a huge mistake going into Iraq. And here's Flournoy signing on with these neocons that we need to send more troops. I think even at this time, Biden admitted that it was a mistake. So, yeah, she's pretty bad. There's a lot of examples. We ran an article from Medea Benjamin. I'll find the title of it while we're talking, because it's pretty good. It just gives a really good background.
Yeah, and while you're doing that real quick, I'll just mention there's been a couple other good articles about just the the potential Biden administration. One by Kevin Gostola, that's running at the gray zone, not his usual place, Shadow Proof, but the gray zone. And then there was one by Alan McLeod at, I think it got published by Mint Press News, and I believe that one actually quoted you on that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's been a couple others, and then Mandy Smithberger had a pretty good article out on it recently. So there's a lot of good work being done at a lot of outlets on this. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's called "Will Michelle Flournoy Be the Angel of Death for the American Empire?" It's a good title too. That's why I wanted to read it. But yeah, and in 20, because she was who people thought would be Hillary's SecDef too. And in 2016, she co-authored a paper with a few hawks from the Center for New American Security, including Robert Kagan, that kind of laid out probably what a Hillary foreign policy would look like. And it doesn't look much different than what the Trump administration turned into. I don't want to give him too much credit. But one of it was, send weapons to Ukraine and increase troop numbers in Syria and Iraq, and just kind of escalate, increase the military budget, face to face China, Russia. I mean, really bad stuff. So, and yeah, and the transition team, there's 23 people. And Sarah Lazara, in these times, she did a report on it, and she found at least 1/3 came from think tanks funded by, the arms industry, and that didn't include RAND. There's 3 people from RAND Corporation, which is funded mostly by the U.S. government and other governments, including the UAE. And that's
NATO.
NATO too. Yeah, it's a really bad think tank. So yeah, it's really half of the Pentagon transition team. It's from these hawkish Washington think tanks. So it's not looking too good. And yeah, so and this is why, I mean, this doesn't give me much hope. I mean, it's good that this happened, but two progressive House Democrats, they sent a letter to Biden warning against appointing a Secretary of Defense with ties to the arms industry. And it was Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan, if I'm saying his name right. But yeah, it was just 2,
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, Barbara Lee even voted against the 2001 AUMF. And so
yeah, yeah,
it's not like the progressives have been listening to her. I mean,
yeah,
she was sounding like she's one of those people that like you even have to give credit to during the Obama administration. She was like against getting involved in Syria, doing
mm,
crazy stuff like that. So yeah, I'm afraid that while it's great that they, sent that letter, that it's going to be, one of those things that like kind of marks that like there were Democrats that were better on this, and that Biden didn't have to be as bad as he was, but that he's just not going to listen and go along with it. And I mean, I think the Michelle Flournoy pick is probably the most obvious example of that. I have another one from you, and this one is about Elliot Abrams, who, man, they talk about somebody who looks evil, right? Like you would think people like him and John Brennan wouldn't be able to get jobs in government just because who wants to look at these guys and like, man, they look like the, exact like figures you think of, like, Mr. Burns and Count Chocula sitting around the Republican table in The Simpsons with the
yeah,
lightning strikes in the background. Like, you can imagine these 2 people like that. Yeah, Elliot Abrams is Mr. Burns and Brennan as the ogre. But here we go. Elliot Abrams says pressure on Iran will continue under Biden. This is a real big concern I have because looking at the Obama or the Biden presidency, one of the few places that I think things could get better when it comes to foreign policy is Iran. He was part of the administration that put together the JCPOA, but there's a couple problems. One is the Trump administration has just levied heavy sanctions on Iran. Then there's the fact that it's really hurt the Iranian economy, and so there's been a lot of reporting by people like Trita Parsi, who about how this has helped power the Houthis in Iran. And then the other issue is that So the U.S. has withdrawn from the deal and placed sanctions on Iran. Within the deal, the Iranians could then walk back some of their commitments to the deal. And so, if the U.S., like, if Biden came into power and during his inauguration speech said, all sanctions on Iran are gone, we're back in the JCPOA, and I'm giving the Iranians 90 days to get back within the deal, or I'm going to invoke the snapback sanctions, something like that, 120 days, however many days he wants to give them. If the Iranians, for whatever reason, either choose not to get back, within every letter of the agreement in that time, or for whatever, we're talking about nuclear product here. So, you point out their low enriched uranium stockpile is several times what it is allowed to under the deal. Now, the U.S. is sanctioning Iran to not let them export any of it, anyways. But if it takes time to get that out of there, then the U.S. could invoke the snapback sanctions. So, if that's the course Biden would take. So, I'm really worried that the policy won't actually get any better under Biden. And in fact, we could end up walking towards a war that way. Why is Elliot Abrams thinking that it's not going to get any, well, by his case, any worse, but any better under Biden?
Well, he cited that their increased stockpile of low enriched uranium for that reason, and he said that they're putting sanctions on Iran that aren't related to the nuclear program, that are related to their ballistic missile program, alleged human rights abuses, and they're trying to enforce that UN arms embargo that expired, that they failed miserably at extending. So they sanctioned some companies that they said like were a procurement network for a Iranian firm that's tied to the military. Again, it's one of those things. It's tough to really know how tied to the military this firm is, but and that's the goal. So I wrote a story. This was going around a lot in a lot of places, that the Trump administration is planning a flood of sanctions before Biden is inaugurated. Every week they plan on adding new sanctions not related to the nuclear program. So I think that's kind of what Abrams is talking about, because for if Biden wanted to go back to the JCPOA, it's all, the path is laid out for him. Like you said, give him the amount of time to um, have the uh, enriched uranium stockpile down and enrich it at a lower percentage, which they can all, it's all easily reversible things. This is like, it's pretty calculated by Iran, and they're not giving anything up.
Yeah.
So that would be easy to do. And then you could lift the sanctions that were put on, over the nuclear program, over through the JCPOA. But then you have all these other sanctions, and sanctions aren't easy really to reverse. They're done with executive action, but it kind of can turn into a whole thing, especially if you have all these, because Republicans are across the board pretty bad on Iran. Even the good ones are still pretty bad on Iran.
Even Rand
Democrats,
Paul.
yeah. Um, and Democrats, there's enough that are bad that he might have a lot of pressure. And then that'll be a question for Iran if they say, okay, if we work to get back into the deal, what about these other sanctions? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I really hope he does it right when he gets in. This is one of the few areas where he could be better than Trump, but it's really what Abrams doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't think. I mean, it's what they're trying to do, but because like he really said the things that they have to work out is the enriched uranium, and they're building the Natanz nuclear facility. They're building like underground there, but part of the reason why they're doing that is because they were sabotaged by Israel earlier this year. In July, there was an explosion at their Natanz nuclear
Mm-hmm.
facility, and it set back their centrifuge program. And Israel hasn't officially taken credit for it, but Israeli media, this is how they usually do things. Benny Gantz, the defense minister, he's made some vague comments. He said, "Oh, Israel isn't necessarily behind every explosion in Iran, but you have these Israeli officials speaking to the media, and it's the same way they usually do things in Syria. They bomb Syria all the time, but they rarely acknowledge it publicly, and it's usually officials. So yeah, I mean, these are all things that can be easily worked out if Biden really wants to work them out. So I think Abrams is wrong there. It's just really about the pressure, and so we'll see what happens. Well, hopefully, I mean, that would be the best way forward with Iran, I think. So
I mean, I'm almost afraid to say this, but from what you were saying, I could, imagine a scenario where Congress adds legislation that says, and I think they did this with Russia to Trump, that says you have to like meet certain requirements to have the sanctions lifted. And so they could totally reverse this whole thing and make it so that Iran has to get back within the deal before the U.S. lifts sanctions, which I mean, the Iranians aren't going to go the fool us twice thing. Also, I would have to imagine that sanctions could turn an economy upside down as far as what you need to produce domestically or not, and as libertarians that we kind of get the supply chain and how important all that is, and so at some point I'm sure the Iranians are going to be less concerned about any supply chain that could involve U.S. sanctions, so some kind from the U.S. or Europe, just because sanctions could be slapped back on at any time. And as you point out, looks like the Republicans are going to maintain control of the Senate, and there are some Democrats who are bad on this, and the House is pretty close. I mean, I think I saw it's if the Democrats get the House, it'd likely be the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. I guess he'd be the ranking member, if I got the terminology right, Bob Menendez. Say that Iran would have to make more concessions
yeah,
for the U.S. to get back into the deal. And what
which they wouldn't do. Yeah,
yeah, that's not
they
going to
wouldn't.
happen.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
um,
that's a good thing to bring up. Yeah, I forgot about that. Um, yeah, I mean, that's not a good sign that he's saying that. He's saying it should include their ballistic limits for their ballistic missiles and stuff. But yeah, they're not going to go for that especially because if you look at Rouhani, he's a moderate, and he faced a lot of pressure from the hardliners in the Iranian government, negotiating the deal. A lot of them didn't want to do it, and then now, 3 years later, the U.S. pulls out, so they're all, saying, "I told you so." So I think he wouldn't have a hard time going back into the deal because, like I said, they're not really giving anything up. But yeah, right away to try to negotiate a tougher deal, no, that's not going to happen.
I mean, I can imagine it being politically unpopular in Iran just with the fact that the U.S. has levied sanctions on the Iranians throughout the COVID pandemic. Like, that
Yeah.
has to feel like just evil to be on the receiving end of that. And I have to
Yeah.
imagine that, and they hold elections in Iran. I know it's not like a free and fair democracy where, the people get a vote for who they want. Not that that really happens in the U.S. either, but it's a little less. It's a little more unofficial and hidden how radar elections are. Where the Iranians, I think the supreme leader gets to pick like the six candidates or something that gets to run, or has to like give his explicit approval, or could reject anybody. I don't know exactly how the rules, but
Mhm.
they the Ayatollahs control a lot of like how the democracy goes, but people do go out and vote, and so like I said, I had to just imagine it be politically unpopular. But before we wrap here, I want to ask you about some fighting that's been going on in northern Ethiopia. You have this the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who I believe won the Nobel Prize last year, Abiy Ahmed, and now it seems like his military is fighting somewhat ruthlessly in this northern region. And I hear Sudan is expecting like 200,000 refugees. So this looks like it could escalate and be fairly serious. I know you're not like a Ethiopia expert or anything like that, but I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a quick breakdown on what's going on here to make it a little bit easier to follow the story.
Yeah. So Abiy Ahmed, he ordered a military operation in the northern Tigray region, he's had some trouble with the local government there since he came into office in 2018. His reforms kind of opened the government up, and the Tigray's People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, they controlled most of the government, from what I understand. They played a pretty big role in overthrowing the Marxist, Soviet-backed leader in 1991. They pretty much controlled the government since. And Ethiopia is a big country. There's over 100 million people, all different ethnic groups. Um, so they're kind of at odds. And then earlier this year, there was like a federal mandate against elections. They held elections because coronavirus. They held elections in Tigray, and then the federal government kind of like officially broke ties with the local government there. They didn't secede or anything, but um, they kind of, I guess, became like a separate entity. And then Abiy claimed that the TPLF attacked a federal army base. It's not really clear who started the violence. TPLF says it was the prime minister, and he ordered a military operation. And they also shut down all the phone and internet service in Tigray, so it's tough to really know what's going on there. But there's some really like gruesome reports of civilians getting killed for their ethnicity. Tigrayans, and on both sides, apparently, government airstrikes have been pretty bad. And then to the north of Tigray is Eritrea, and the TPLF have accused Eritrea of sending troops to fight them, to help the federal government of Ethiopia fight the TPLF. It's that there's a good chance that happened, but it's tough to know. But today or yesterday, I think it was today, the TPLF said that they fired missiles into Eritrea. So that's a big escalation. So now it is bringing in another country if they weren't already involved. Yeah, in Sudan, there's thousands of refugees going to Sudan. Apparently, Ethiopia pulled their troops out of Somalia because they were there, along with a bunch of other countries, with the U.S. fighting Al Shabaab, to focus on this. And it could turn into a real nasty civil war. Um, it's a apparent the TPLF. They're a pretty formidable fighting force, from what I understand. There's like their army has like 250,000 people in it, so it's a lot. And it could turn pretty big. And then as far as the U.S. is related to this, obviously there's been a lot going on. I haven't seen too many comments from U.S. officials, but when it first started, Pompeo made a statement and denouncing the TPLF for starting the violence, so kind of taking the prime minister's side. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, it sounds like it's pretty bad there.
I know that last year the prime minister of Ethiopia, what I believe he won the Nobel Prize for, was closing down his country's ongoing uh, dispute with Eritrea. Do you know if like that dispute resolution was over the same region, and if that like is at all the cause of the fighting, or like it other than the allegations that it just kind of escalated and then they attacked an Ethiopian base? Is there any idea of exactly why the fighting started?
No, I'm not really sure. Eritrea and Tigray, um, they have a history of fighting each other at the border there, and that is one of the reasons why the TPLF didn't like Abiy when he came in, was because he, like you said, he kind of settled things with Eritrea. So they've kind of accused him of plotting against the TPLF, I think, for a
Okay.
while. But yeah, I mean, I really don't know how it started. They said that the federal government started, like, this is the TPLF. Their side of the story is that the federal government started massing troops near the border of Tigray a few weeks ago, and that they planned it. So yeah, it's one of those things that's tough to know now. Exactly who started it. It might become more clear. It's kind of like Nagorno-Karabakh. It was a little tricky to realize who started it, but as the fighting went on, it kind of became clear as Azerbaijan. because you saw it came out that they just bought there's like a surge in weapons purchases from Turkey and Israel and stuff right before the fighting, and um, so yeah, we'll see how I'll be keeping an eye on this one.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I was going to ask is, other than following you at antiwar.com, do you have any like recommendations? Like, I have no idea where to get news on Ethiopia. So, is there like a particular couple Twitter accounts or a news outlet that seems to be doing a decent job of covering this, or is it just trying to find little things here and there and piece it together?
I kind of have been piecing it together. I might find some better stuff. I'll let you know if I do. Right now, I mean, I kind of use mostly mainstream places like Reuters and AP
Yeah.
and AFP because they have reporters there. And then if you go to allafrica.com, they kind of put stuff together for each country. They use a lot of the same outlets, but it's a good spot. So
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on. We'll have to do this again soon. And just before we all wrap up and make this official, why don't you just tell people where they can find your work and any ways to support you other than reading antiwar.com.
yeah, antiwar.com. It's my uh, main gig now. So that's where you'll find me. I'm on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at DeCamp Dave, and subscribe to our daily newsletter. And we're going to be having a fundraiser soon, so you might get some letters from me.
All right.
Asking
And
for money. So, yeah, antiwar.com. I'm really trying to get it going. You know, I just started full time a couple months ago, so I'm getting in the groove of writing for the news section every day, and I'm trying to just make it bigger and better. So, yeah.
yeah, no, it's, I definitely noticed since you've been writing full time that I mean, it makes me a lot easier to like nail down stuff in while I'm trying to do my news roundups in the morning. Everybody, just check out the Libertarian Institute for my show and the news roundup, and also Scott republishes some of Dave's articles there, so you catch those in the featured section over at libertarianinstitute.org as well. Thank you.